Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my February reading wrap-up video. I'm super excited to film this because in February I managed to read a grand total of 8 books, which honestly astounds me because I had a pretty mixed bag month. I read a lot of books that I either were just kind of okay with, or I wanted to DNF, or was very disappointed by at the beginning of the month, and then at the end of the month I actually read some books that I really ended up loving. So I'm honestly amazed that I managed to read as much as I did. So without me blabbing on, because I swear to God I have tried filming this intro 3 to 4 times now and I'm getting very tired of it. Here are the books that I read in February. So the first book that I read in February was actually one that is going to be showcasing on a reading vlog, which hopefully will be uploaded at some point this year. I started it last year. This is now the second book that I have read for this reading vlog, so hopefully you'll see it soon, but because I'm a mood reader, it will just be uploaded when I'm in the mood to read the last book, so I don't know what to tell you about that. But the first book that I read in February was Poster Girl by Veronica Roth. Now, unless you live under a rock, you would know that Veronica Roth is the author of the Divergent trilogy, which I absolutely loved back in the day when I was a teenager. And I do believe that this is Veronica Roth's first step into adult literature. However, it still has those like bare bone dystopian vibes to it that Divergent had. So in this book we are following a young woman named Sonia, and I believe if I've done the math right she's around about 25, although the book never actually tells you, which is super annoying. And she is living in Seattle, Portland, and originally, before you even enter her story in this book, Seattle, Portland was controlled by this organisation called the Delegation, and her own father was kind of like one of the heads of this organisation, and everyone was under 24-hour surveillance because the Delegation made it mandatory to have kind of like this computerised system put in people's eyes called the Insight. And what the Insight would do is, for instance, it would do some really great things, like you would look at a building and it would tell you all the information for that building. However, what it also did was it regulated people's actions. So for instance, if I did a good deed, like I helped someone cross the road or someone fell over and I picked them up, it would reward me with points. But if I did something bad, for instance I swore in public or I ran around naked, like it would take away points. And in this dystopian world, essentially the people at the top were reaping the benefits, and the people who were lower classes and stuff just found that they could never get ahead and never actually live the life that they wanted to live. So now when we jump into the story, there has been a revolution, the Delegation has been overthrown, and Sonia now lives in this kind of like squared off part of the city called the Aperture. And the Aperture is basically a prison for anyone who was linked to the Delegation, anyone who worked for the Delegation, or family members that worked for the Delegation. If you had anything to do with the Delegation, you are now in this prison and you cannot leave. You can't earn your freedom. There's just no way of doing it. And Sonia is given the opportunity by the new organisation that's taken over to try and hunt for this missing girl who was essentially taken by the Delegation and given to a new family. They can't find her, and so they say to Sonia, look, if you can find her, you'll earn your freedom and you can get out of here. So not only are you seeing kind of what the world is like now that there's been a revolution, but you are also kind of on this mystery subplot in the story. Now the first thing that I'll say about this, and I feel like this is very much a me thing, it's a very nitpicky thing to say, but I do feel like the descriptions in this book were somewhat lacking, or they came too late. For instance, when I mentioned Sonia's age earlier, her age was never mentioned, and so I had to kind of do the math myself. And when I went into this, I wasn't really sure whether I was reading a young adult or an adult, because it kind of does read a little bit young adult-ish, and the actual characters come across as young adult. But then when you start reading the story, you kind of start clicking things together and you're like, okay, so if she was this old when she did the poster, because obviously she's known as the poster girl because she did this whole poster thing for the Delegation, then how old is she now if it's been X amount of years? And you're having to do the math yourself, and so I couldn't really picture Sonia. And there were also a lot of characters within the Aperture, and a lot of characters that were just mentioned throughout the story that I never really could pick up a description for, because I would forget who they were. Like, there were so many names, so much to take in, and I was just honestly a little bit overwhelmed. I think the other nitpicky thing I'll say is that as a standalone, this is a really good standalone. Like, it's okay, like, it's decent. However, because it does take place in this kind of like post-dystopian world, I feel like with dystopian in general, I always want more. And by saying that, what I mean is there's just so much that you can do with dystopian worlds, and obviously so much going on, and I want to know what's going on outside of the area that Sonia is living. I want to know how the delegation came to be. I want to know what's going on with this new organisation, and I want to know what's going on with this other revolutionary group. Like, there's just so much that you could do, and I feel like for a standalone this is okay, but I always want more. I did also think that this book was kind of meant to be a little bit emotional, especially at one point, but honestly I just found myself not really connecting to the story or the characters that much, and overall I just didn't really find it that memorable. Like, now that I'm talking about it to you guys, I'm obviously remembering parts of the story and I remember it now, but you asked me what this book was about, I don't know, 4 months down the line, and I won't be able to tell you what happened. This book definitely read more as a YA than an adult book, which was kind of disappointing as well. I felt like the writing was sort of in a simplistic style like you would find YA, but also the characters themselves felt more like young adult teen characters than they felt like adult characters, and maybe that's a reflection of the world that they lived in. But honestly, when it comes to adult, I expect something deeper, and I just wasn't getting that with this book. The one positive thing that I will say about this book is that I really did like the exploration of kind of like class issues and the privilege issues that surrounded the leaders of like the delegation and, you know, the new founders as well. I think issues like that can definitely be used to explore issues within our own world. So I did find that really interesting, and I feel like that's what I mean when I say I want it to go deeper, is I want those subjects explored. I want the world explored more and the issues surrounding it, and I just didn't get that, but I did enjoy that about it. Overall, I gave this 3 stars. I wouldn't completely write off Veronica Roth's writing. This was okay. Divergent, like, I read it when I was a teenager. That trilogy was great. It was fun. It was YA. It was everything that I wanted. And this just was like, it was okay. The second book that I read in February, oh my god, this kills me. I read House of Flame and Shadow by Sarah J Maas. This is the 3rd, and I won't say final book, but I will say final book in the sense that it's the final book in the Crescent City original trilogy, but it's going to be extended, so technically not last book. But this was the big daddy that everyone was waiting for. I was so excited for this, and let me tell you, it was a flop. It was a big flop, and that kills me to say. I have to say this was my most anticipated, with a capital A, release of the year. So obviously I'm not going to spoil anything, just to give you a brief overview of what this trilogy series is about. So in the original trilogy you are following a young woman named Bryce, and a year prior in the 1st book her best friend and a bunch of her other friends ended up being murdered, and then a year later she is kind of given this like guard to protect her, but also she is given him so that they can work together to try and work out who's murdering people, because the murders have started back up again and they think that she has a link to it, and the plot goes from there. And obviously if you've read any Sarah J Maas books you know that the plot goes a lot deeper than just like some murder mystery. So I feel like the one positive thing that I will say about this book is, did I devour it? Yes, I devoured all 800 odd pages. It was entertaining, okay? I still found it fast-paced. I still really liked the effortless flow of Sarah J Maas's writing. I think it's really simple. It was, you know, sort of easy to understand, and I felt like the ending wrapped up well, in the sense that it wraps up the original story well, but it also leaves an opening for what are obviously going to be the next books in the series. I don't know how many it's going to be, but who knows. Obviously I'm not going to spoil anything major, but the one thing that I really want to say is that this was a shit show. I've been seeing so many people on specifically Booktok, because I don't know what people have said on Booktube yet. People on Booktok have been attacking anyone who says anything negative about this book by saying that the only reason that people were disappointed and saying things that are negative is because they were expecting things to happen that didn't happen, and they wanted this book to be a different book in a different series. And to that I say, bullshit. What the fuck did you read? I'm sorry. I have been reading Sarah J Maas books since 20... Oh, this is where it gets iffy. I think 2013. Sorry, correction. 2015, because that was when ACOTAR released, and that was the first Sarah J Maas book that I ever read. So I've been reading her books for a very, very long time, and this book was not what I had come to expect from a Sarah J Maas book. It was all over the fucking place. I have an extensive reading vlog if you want to see my reactions and see my kind of like overall thoughts with spoilers for basically every single Sarah J Maas book that has been released, so don't click on it if you haven't read any of them. But it was a fucking shit show. Bryce did not feel like Bryce in this book. She felt like a whole different character. People have been comparing her to Aylin from Throne of Glass, and that really fucks me off, because Aylin had a reason for being the way that she was, and I feel like she never did anything to be a bitch. She did things with purpose. Bryce was being a bitch for the sake of being a bitch. There were things that happened in this book which were just simply brushed over, not just overall but also by Bryce herself. Bryce was completely nasty to a lot of people in this book, including her own so-called mate. I don't know what to say. The other thing that I will say is that this felt extremely rushed, and the way that I would put this is a way that I saw this on Booktok, because honestly when I heard this description I was like, okay, that's hit the nail on the head for me. Like, that's exactly what I was thinking, because someone said they were expecting the same epic level of Kingdom of Ash but in this series. The battle that happens in this was not what I thought it was going to be. It literally happened so incredibly fast, and it seemed so incredibly easy to do certain things that shouldn't have been easy to do, and it just made zero fucking sense. The only redeeming quality of this book for me was one particular character, and I won't say who it is, but they carried this fucking 800 odd page book on their highly flammable back, and if you read this you know exactly which fucking character I'm going on about. And I'm gonna go out here and say that action scene with that particular character that happened kind of like in the middle of the book, that was better than the battle at the end. What the fuck? What the fuck? This literally just didn't even... I don't know what to say. This didn't feel like a Sarah J Maas book. I didn't go into this book wanting any theories to be correct. I didn't go into this book expecting it to be another book in a different series. I didn't expect anything. The only thing that I expected was an epic battle and everything to come together and be like, yes, like this makes sense, like everything's tying up, battle's gonna be epic, it's gonna be done over like a really good amount of time. This whole book takes place in a week. It was a fucking shit show. There's been a thing going around to say that Sarah J Maas scrapped her initial first draft of this book and then rewrote it in 5 weeks, and honestly, that makes so much fucking sense. You know, the only thing that this book did was instill a fear in me of being completely disappointed by the next Sarah J Maas book, and I hate saying that because I fucking love her books. I don't know what to say. It was bad. It was bad. Originally I rated this a 4-star on Goodreads, and that was simply because of that one character that carried this book. However, I changed it to a 3-star because I didn't want to give it a high rating on something that is used to be a reflection for other people, so I brought it down to a 3-star. I don't know what to say. I'm waiting 2 years for this, for it to be this bad. Like, there were things happening that didn't make sense. There were things happening that were like massive plot holes, and like, I know that Sarah J Maas probably isn't the most incredible fantasy writer ever. You know, people are always nitpicking her stuff, but I've always loved it because it's easy to read, easy to follow, and I love her characters and the stories and the romance and everything else. I thought this was my second favourite series, and I would only honestly say that about the first book in this series now. The second book, you know, that was alright, but the first book in this series was superior, and I will stand by that because that was incredible. just read the first book and then never read on, is what I'll say. Just read the first book and don't read the other two. Not worth it. The third book that I read in February was Legendary by Stephanie Garber. This is the second book in the Caraval trilogy. This was a trilogy that I originally said that I was never going to read on with because I didn't like the first book. I rated it 2 stars. However, I read Once Upon a Broken Heart and that made me want to read on with the Caraval series. So I have, which I'll just say now, if you are going to be one of those people that's like, I don't like Caraval, but I'm going to read Once Upon a Broken Heart because I don't need to read Caraval. People are lying to you. You do need to read Caraval because there is way more context for Once Upon a Broken Heart if you read Caraval. I went into Once Upon a Broken Heart and I enjoyed it, but there was just a lot of stuff that I did not understand, and honestly I was just confused.com. So my plan is to read the rest of Caraval and then read Once Upon a Broken Heart. I actually really liked Legendary more than Caraval. I didn't like Caraval for the simple reason that it followed the older sister, who I really didn't like. She was a wet wipe. I hated it. The second book follows her younger sister, and so you only get her point of view. And whilst this book was repetitive in the sense that it very much felt like Caraval, because again, you're in this Caraval game, so you're having to follow this game with the end goal of winning. It was just still way more fun. I enjoyed the environment that they were in a lot more, because in this one they actually go on a ship to somewhere else and play the game in this like new kingdom. But also the sister was just way more fun as well. Like, I feel like she had a bit more like spark to her. The other thing that I'll say is that the plot twist and the ending, I feel like in not just this one but also Caraval, the ending and the plot twist are a little bit predictable and anticlimactic. I don't know if that's because it's YA and I've just read so many books now that I just come to expect certain things, but they didn't shock me. Like, when they happened, when the revelations happened, I'm not shocked. However, what I will say is, and this is why I'm glad I've continued on with this, I loved the introduction of Jax, because in Once Upon a Broken Heart, he's kind of like a little bit of a solemn character. Like, I liked him in that, but I didn't love him. I don't know if that makes sense. But then when I read Legendary, oh my god, I could see why people are obsessed with Jax. I love him. He's so funny, but like in that kind of I'm evil, you should hate me way. I love him. I'm obsessed with him. I get why girlies are like, oh my god, I'm a Jax girl. I get it. So I'm really glad that I read this one. I did give it 3 stars. Overall I thought that it was way better than Caraval, and I do want to read the third book, but now I've read that the third book takes place with the younger sister's point of view again, and I don't know if I can do that to myself, but I need to, because I need to know how this ends, because I need to know how they got from that book to where they are in Once Upon a Broken Heart, because I've got no fucking clue how that happened. So the next book that I read in February was actually an audiobook, and it's my first audiobook of the year. Now last year I did start listening to audiobooks, and I did mainly start listening to non-fiction because I feel like it's a good way to incorporate non-fiction in my life without actually having to go through the drivel of actually reading it, because sometimes I feel like non-fiction, especially the non-fiction that I read, which is usually crime, is sometimes a little bit tedious to read. You feel like you're reading a Wikipedia page sometimes, and I just feel like audiobooks are way more fun. But that audiobook was Unlawful Killings, Life, Love and Murder, Trials at the Old Bailey by Wendy Joseph KC. So Wendy Joseph KC is actually a judge at the Old Bailey, which, little history lesson for you guys, I don't know if it's in the UK or in the world in general, but the Old Bailey is a very, very old courthouse here in the UK, and it is one of the courthouses that does some of the most infamous trials, and a lot of the trials tend to be murder trials. And so Wendy Joseph actually presides over some of these murder trials, and this book is kind of fictitious in the way that she writes about trials that she's done, but she does them in a way where she doesn't write, you know, names into them, but she kind of like, I think what she said at the beginning of the audiobook is that she had seen all of these situations happen, but they might not necessarily have been linked to a particular case that she did. I guess it's like a law thing, you know, she doesn't want to mention like actual cases, but either way you get a look into the life of a judge at the Old Bailey, which I just think is so fascinating. And I'm telling you, okay, if you are into non-fiction crime and you're looking for your next audiobook in particular, give this one a go. This is the best audiobook that I've listened to so far, and I feel like it will be hard to top this one. I tried listening to a couple of other audiobooks after listening to this one, and I struggled and I clicked off and I stopped listening because this one was just so engaging. Initially, Wendy Joseph gives her like introduction chapter, and then the chapters after that, there are, I believe, 2 narrators. So there is a male narrator at the beginning who kind of gives you a brief story of the trial that's going to be talked about, and then after that you have a female narrator, and she basically goes through the trial and the life of Wendy Joseph as she's proceeding over these trials, and she does all of these different voices so well, and you don't get lost at any point because literally all the voices sound different for the different, you know, people involved. The trials themselves are so engaging. There was literally one trial I was listening to, and there was kind of like a little plot twist with it, and when it happened, I kid you not, I gasped. I literally was listening and I was like, what? Like, what the fuck just happened? It was as if I was listening to a fictitious book, but then obviously I realised that this actually happened to people. Like, this shit happened. Besides that, what this book also did really well is it showed the strengths and obviously the shortfalls of our justice system, and Wendy does go into a little bit of detail of how she feels like crime could be tackled a little bit better, but I also think it's just such a broad issue that there are so many factors in why people commit crime that I don't ever feel like you could tackle it to the extent that you would want to. And so in that way, I feel like the book almost missed its point a little bit, because I feel like it just doesn't go deep enough to answer those questions. Like, there's so many different ways you could go with answering the question of how to tackle crime, and I just don't think that the trials that were showcased in this book kind of answer that question, because they're very specific cases, and just as a criminology student, it's just a hard question to answer, and I don't really feel like maybe she should have led this book in that direction. Honestly, I would have just been happy kind of like listening to the trials and hearing about her life as a judge. The only other negative thing that I would say is I did still get a little bit lost with all of the law jargon. She does try and explain it well, and she has kind of written this book to kind of help people have an insight into what the world of law is like and what the world of the courtroom is like. So I do like that, but there are points where I'm just like, oh, like, I really do not understand what's going on here. I definitely don't understand the jargon. But overall, I absolutely loved this audiobook. I ended up giving it a whopping 4 stars, and honestly, it's gonna be hard to top now. The next book that I read in February was These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong, and I'm gonna be upfront now and tell you guys that the last 30% of this book, I actually had to listen to the audiobook because I was struggling. I definitely feel like I should have DNF'd this book before I got over halfway. Unfortunately, I was that far in that I just felt like I had to keep going, and the audiobook was the only way for me to do that, because I knew that I would have struggled to finish this otherwise. So this is basically a YA duology that is a retelling of the story of Romeo and Juliet. It takes place in a 1920s Shanghai, and obviously there are 2 warring gangs, and our main character Juliet is on one of them, and our other character Roma is on the other, and obviously they had kind of like a little love thing going on, and then they fell apart because their 2 gangs were warring. Juliet is now back, and there are a string of murders happening, and so Juliet and Roma team together to try and solve them. First of all, obviously it goes without saying, but I just found the pacing of this book incredibly slow. When I first started this book, and the reason why I gave it so much of a chance is just because I was constantly on the edge of thinking that this was about to get better and I was about to really love it, and I just couldn't get past the pacing. I found the writing also really tedious. I just found it a little bit too descriptive sometimes, and I think one of the main issues for me about this book was I was honestly expecting it to be a little bit more action-packed than it was. The only time that this book gets action-packed are like really small scenes in between, and then right at the end, the ending, incredible. If the ending had been like the whole book, I would have loved it. I also found that I wasn't really connected to the romance storyline, and I feel like the main reason is because obviously Juliet and Roma have already kind of like established their romance before you're already diving into this book. They've just fallen apart, and I feel like for me, when it comes to that kind of thing, I prefer to see flashbacks a lot more, and I prefer to see kind of a build up to the romance again. I just didn't feel connected to it, and I wanted more. And you know when you read a romance and you get those little like fuzzies, you're like, oh my god, like they're gonna kiss. I never got that, and I was so disappointed. Overall, I loved the idea of this one, and I loved the ending. When the ending happened, I just went, oh my god. And it makes me want to read the next one, but I genuinely don't think I could make it through. I think if I read it, I would have to go audiobook, but I don't think I can do it. And it makes me so sad because she's come out with a new book recently called, I think, The Immortal. So I'm wondering whether I might like that more. Someone let me know in the comments if I should give it a go, because right now I'm really not sure about Chloe Gong's writing. Overall, I gave this one 2 stars. I was super disappointed. I'm glad that I read it, but I'm really disappointed. The 6th book that I read in February was Butcher and Blackbird by Bryn Weaver. This is an adult dark rom-com that follows 2 serial killers. One is named Rowan and the other is named Sloane, and they are serial killers who hunt other serial killers. And at one point at the beginning of the book, Sloane finds herself locked in a cage by one of the serial killers that she was hunting, and Rowan comes along because he was hunting the same guy, and so they form a connection there, and then Rowan kind of falls head over heels for her, and so he sets up this competition between the two of them that will happen every single year, where Rowan's brother will find them a target and they have to figure out who the target is, and whoever kills them first will end up winning the game. And obviously along with that comes a romance storyline. Now, I didn't think that I would love this book, but I loved this book. If you're thinking it sounds crazy, it is crazy, and there's a lot of dark humour. There's some gore as well, so watch out for that if you don't like that kind of thing. But I really loved this. This was like laugh out loud funny, and I can't remember the last time I actually laughed out loud reading a book. The only bad things that I would say is that there were a couple of like repetitive phrases and like character actions that I found a little bit irritating after a while, and I also do wish that there was a little bit more build up to the romance, because obviously this competition only happens once every year, and I want those little connections in between, and there kind of are little connections between the two of them, but I wanted more build up, and I don't really feel like there was any. But this one definitely took me by surprise. There were plot twists in this one that I wasn't expecting, and they honestly shocked me, and I didn't expect them to. And what guts me right now is the fact that I was going to go straight on to the second book because I thought it was already released, and it's not. It comes out in June, so I have something to look forward to, but I was also really annoyed that I couldn't just move on to the next one. Overall, I thought this was really fast paced. I really enjoyed the writing, and I literally cannot wait to read more books by this author, and I ended up giving this one 4 stars. The 7th book that I read in February was Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is Ali Hazelwood's, I guess, first dip, hopefully first dip, one of many, into the paranormal romance genre. In this book we are following a young woman named Misery, and this takes place in kind of like a futuristic America where 100 or like 1,000 odd years ago there were genetic mutations within humans that now meant that vampires exist and werewolves exist, and now in this kind of area of America that Misery now lives, it is split into 3 factions. So you have the humans, you have the werewolves, and you have the vampires, and they're all separated from each other because they can't get along and they've always been warring. Now Misery at some point is kind of given this ultimatum by her father, and she is set to marry the alpha leader of the wolves, and she has to go over there and live with them for a year and obviously be married to this alpha, and then I guess she can go back to her life either living with the vampires or living with the humans again. Guys, this This might be my favourite Ali Hazelwood book ever. I thought I loved The Love Hypothesis. The Love Hypothesis has nothing on this. I ate this up. It was so good. This put me back in like my 2009 Twilight era. Oh my god. I was obsessed with this. If you've read any Ali Hazelwood books before and you're thinking, oh, I don't know whether Bride is for me, read it. Read it. The pacing of the romance, oh, it was slow burn, it was angsty, it was giving everything that it needed to give. Obviously this is kind of like a dystopian-esque world. I wouldn't necessarily say it's fantasy, I'd say it's dystopian-esque. I felt like there was enough world building in this for it not to be confusing, and the best way I would describe this is if you've read Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, the world building is a little bit like that, where you're given just enough to know what's going on, but you're also not going to be super confused and super overwhelmed. I also really like the mystery aspect of this book. I did feel like some of the plot twists were kind of anticlimactic, and honestly I was just in this book for the romance, but oh my god, this is the best Ali Hazelwood book that I've read yet, and I'm scared to pick up another in case I'm disappointed by it. But seriously, I hope she either writes more in this world or she writes more paranormal romance, because I think this might be her calling. I think it might be, and I need more. I just Thank you, Ali Hazelwood, for blessing my mind with more paranormal romance that I didn't realise I needed. If you'd like to put paranormal recommendations in the comments, then please feel free, because I would like more. I forgot how much I love this genre. And if you couldn't already tell, I gave this 5 stars. This was my 1 5-star read of the month, and I'll never be getting over it. Now on to the last book that I read in February, which this kind of made February go out with a bang, and not in a good way, but in a sad way, and that is If He Had Been With Me by Laura Nowlin. This is a YA contemporary that follows our character Autumn, who has lived next door to her mum's best friend's son her whole life, and they have like this really great friendship going on until they get to high school and they kind of drift apart, and then eventually kind of like drift back together again. This book kind of goes through the trials and tribulations of being a teenager, kind of entering high school, having a first boyfriend, and all of those issues that teens deal with, whilst also learning the backstory that leads up to the final point of this book. So at the beginning, you find out that her best friend, Finn, who is the next door neighbour, has been in a car accident, and you know that things are going to be bad because she kind of tells you that things are going to be bad, and then you get to the bad thing and you're like, yeah, that was pretty bad. Now, I gave this 3 stars, but I want to start this by saying that it's a very, very good 3 stars. The only reason I didn't give it 4 or 5 was just because I don't know, I felt very conflicted about this book. First of all, I loved the pacing. I felt like the pacing of this book was very, very quick. When I initially saw how many chapters there were, because there's like 70 to 80 odd chapters in this book, I was kind of scared because what kind of a book has that many chapters? Turns out the chapters are only like 2 to 3 pages long, so you end up speeding through it very, very quickly. But what I will say is I feel like it jumps around a lot, so you kind of like skip forward a little bit, like you might skip forward a few days, you might skip forward to a different time in the day. But also there are some issues in this book that, whilst I'm glad they're kind of mentioned because I feel like they're really important topics, not just for adults like myself but also young adults in general, I don't really feel like you delve deeper into those topics. And I would have liked to have done kind of like a deeper dive into them and actually explore what those characters are going through and how they feel. The whole way through reading this book, I had this very like melancholic feeling. I was just sad the whole way through this book, and I'm not sure whether it's because I knew something sad was going to happen or because I was just in that frame of mind, but it honestly felt very reminiscent to me of the way I felt when I read the second Summer I Turned Pretty book. That whole book, I was sad. I was just sad. I was longing for something that was lost that I couldn't gain back, and I just felt that the whole time I was reading this book as well. The characters do come across as juvenile and naive, but honestly that is a reflection of their age. I did really love how YA this felt. I honestly feel like sometimes YA doesn't feel like YA anymore, and this one honestly did, and I just loved it. And I've seen a lot of people on Booktok mention that they feel like this one was really slow and they hated it. I don't know what it was about this book, but I have been thinking about it for days. I have not read a lot of the book that I'm currently reading because I'm struggling not to think about the characters in this book and what happened. And I didn't even realise that there was a sequel that had released this year, but you can bet your bottom dollar bill I'm going to be reading it. And I'm going to be in my sad girl era again. And I can't wait. And I would also like to say I love Finney. I love Finney with my whole heart, and honestly, if you want a book that is possibly going to make you cry, just read this. So those were the 8 books that I read in February. If you read any of these books, then please let me know what you thought in the comments. If not, let me know what your favourite or least favourite book was in February that you read. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to see more content from me, then don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. So bye guys.